Well, hello everybody and welcome to today's workshop, Web Dev with Scout. This workshop is brought to you by Pathfinder. Pathfinder is an extracurricular program at Northeastern that provides an inclusive space for first and second year students who are looking to discover their passions. If you haven't already joined Pathfinder and you are a first and second year student, we can put the application for you in the chat. We also have moderator applications for third, fourth, fifth year, and recent graduate students. So we'll put that link in the chat too. And we'll also put the link to our website in the chat if you want to check out more about the program. We have a bunch of other workshops coming up. Our next one is tomorrow with RSA, and they'll be talking about life on campus. You can come and ask them any questions that you have. And we can put that link in the chat also. And now we will pass it over to Scout.
Yeah, hello everyone. Okay, I've got a tiny laptop and many screens open to see Zoom in the chat and everything, but if you have any questions at any point during this, just feel free to unmute yourselves and shout out, and I'd be happy to talk to you. But thank you all for coming. Essentially, what we're going to go over today is the process of learning web development. So this workshop is less about like coding HTML or CSS or JavaScript in the workshop itself, because there are really tons and tons of resources out there on the internet for you to do that kind of thing, and it can take a while. The really overwhelming part about web development is that there's a million ways to do everything. And you hear a lot about technologies like React and JavaScript frameworks and all of this stuff that at the end of the day is honestly not where you should start if you want to get the best experience and the most well-rounded knowledge for any kind of front-end career. And if you build on the fundamental topics that we talk about today, then I think that learning things like React and other stuff will be a lot easier for you, and you'll get a lot faster at it, and you can be more successful as a whole. So essentially what we're going to do is we'll go over the major web technologies, which is in this case pretty much HTML, CSS, and JS. There's some extra stuff if we have time at the end, but we'll see if we get to it. And then I'll just provide some tips on like generally what I think is the most important stuff to learn. And yeah, that's pretty much that. So yeah, if we get to number 3, it'll be like JavaScript web applications and rich things like that, but we'll see. So visually, here's kind of a timeline. Is I think the first 2 we're going to talk about that go kind of hand in hand is HTML and CSS. And then after that comes JavaScript. And then after that comes HTTP, or getting data, real live data, onto your website, and then deploying something and putting it on the internet. So I just kind of wanted to start just to get a sense, raise your hand, what web technologies is anybody familiar with, or what tech stacks do you know? And a tech stack, if you're not familiar, is just a set of technologies used together to produce an application. China?
I guess like we were just talking about CSS and HTML. I know a little bit about like just the general about like titles, subtitles, how to like bold text and change colors and stuff like that. But I do need a refresher, so definitely today will help out.
Cool. Yeah, absolutely. Anyone else? How about put something in the chat if you have literally no web development experience, or basically nothing. If you're here, I suppose. I have no idea. Okay, cool. Yeah. The fortunate thing is that the basic stuff, the like these fundamentals, are honestly pretty straightforward to pick up, especially if you do some focused projects. There'll be a little bit of a project at the end of this as well that you can try. It's designed to be really human readable and understandable. So of all of the coding languages out there, HTML and CSS are probably the most human friendly. So, but that's good to know. And again, if you have any questions during this point or any point, let me know. All right, cool. So I think first thing we're going to start with is HTML, essentially. And another question for everyone is, what do people know about HTML already? It is definitely a markup language. That's good. So actually don't know how to exactly define a markup language, but I think, and Tanvi, you can actually correct me here if I'm wrong, a markup language is built with tags, which is what we'll see in a second. Yes, the frame of the website. That hits the nail on the head. So HTML is like the first and probably most important thing, because you will never stop using HTML no matter what you do. Everything that goes on the web is almost everything that goes on the web is made out of HTML, and all those fancy things like React and other web applications are just tools for generating and modifying HTML and CSS. So essentially what it is it stands for hypertext markup language, which you don't need to remember, but is fun to know. And HTML is stored in an HTML file and then is made up of HTML elements. And as I said, every single web framework produces HTML. So familiarizing yourself with it is very important. And as mentioned, it gives the web page its structure. So it tells the browser what to render. And it also tells the user what types of content are in a web page. So here on the left is like a very small snippet of HTML. There's an H1 tag, which represents heading 1. There are 6 in total, but it has an ID, which we can talk about in a little bit, and then some text inside of it, and then it closes. So that's kind of what the markup piece is. And then a web browser like Google Chrome or Firefox is a piece of software that takes a look at HTML and gives it visual meaning. Essentially, all browsers do this differently, but at the end of the day, they form some visual output, which you would see on the right here, which is just unstyled text of my header, essentially. So this is like a very common structure that you might see with HTML, where usually all of HTML is wrapped in an HTML tag itself. And then there's a header, and that includes some information like title or other information about the website. And then there's the body, which contains pretty much the rest of the content. And then there's often far more markdown in the bit between that. But as I said, this should basically be the first thing you learn, as you'll always be writing HTML somehow. And there are a ton of HTML elements out there, but some of them are particularly useful. And I would recommend that, I'll list them in a little bit, but you would take a look at these, familiarize with them, yourself with them, and what they do by default. So you notice like back here, this text is just kind of like styled, kind of ugly, but it looks styled. That's what a browser does by default with an H1 tag. And there's default behavior for all the different types of HTML tags. So knowing what that default behavior is very useful for you when you're building a website. And then another important thing to learn is how to structure HTML files in a project so that you keep yourself organized and can produce something readable. So I thought we'd just hop into just a tiny example real quick in a CodePen. Excuse me, the Zoom controls. So basically, as you said, like we have this header 1 tag, and that outputs like this. And then this one is a P, which represents a paragraph. And you can see the text is styled differently. And then you have other elements like buttons. And this is a little bit of JavaScript, which we'll talk about later. But each element has their own individual attributes that do different things. So like here, when the onClick attribute for the button is executed, which is when you click on the button, it does whatever's in here. All right, cool. So speaking back to what I would consider probably the most prominent or common HTML elements you'll come across is these. These all have various forms. HTML is what wraps them. Title is what makes this tab change. Head, it contains lots of different information about the site and often contains things like meta tags, which can tell you information like who wrote the website and some other different functions. Nav is a thing for when you have website navigation. So if you ever go on a website like the Scout website, for instance, up here, this is like a nav. You would put this in a nav tag. Then you have things like body, which contains the document. Style, it can be used to put CSS inside of HTML. Div is a very fundamental common one. You'll use lots of divs. Div is just kind of like a container that you can put content inside. So people often use it a lot for styling and things like that. Span is very similar to div, except that divs kind of go on top of each other and spans go this way. That's pretty much the difference. There's image, H1 through H6, paragraph. These are for links. These are for unordered lists. These are forms, which have become important later. Inputs for forms, and then footer. This is something used, which you can, in a sec, I'll point you to some resources, but this just kind of like tells the browser often that a document is HTML and not any other kind of markdown. And then this is something you can use to put JavaScript in a page. So just one quick thing to notice about these is that a lot of them speak to exactly what they are, like image and nav and H1 through H6. And the reason this is true is because HTML is designed to be semantic and human readable. And this is good for accessibility. So lots of the time, web accessibility will be something that you hear about, and using the right HTML tags for the right job is very important, because things like screen readers, can everyone hear me okay? Can I get a thumbs up? Okay, cool. Sorry, Siri interrupted me. Things like screen readers and the like rely on proper HTML to tell people who aren't necessarily as properly cited or anything what is happening on a web page. Sorry, excuse me. Okay. So just to pause, are there any questions?
Hi, I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm actually wondering, this might be too specific, but I'm just curious if we need to make tabs on a website on the top. So do we use nav and span there? I'm not sure when to use span. So could you just tell me what exactly you use when you want to like place tabs on the top of our website?
Yeah. Do you mean like, let's see if I can find a website that is a good example.
Actually, the one that is just open right down there, your highlights, trending, design, tech, culture, and news, those tabs.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah, so that kind of depends. I think generally nav is expected to be something like top level navigation for the entire website. So if you're using it for that case, like this is something persistent in the top right corner, top left corner, that would definitely make sense. Having multiple navs may or may not be confusing. There is additional context. I can point you towards some resources for this, but you can provide additional context for HTML elements for accessibility purposes, like saying this nav is for changing the content on the screen, and this nav is for changing the page on the website, so that screen readers can understand that. Accessibility is kind of like a deep hole that you can do a lot of different stuff for, but otherwise, like regarding span and things like that, it really relies on the visual effect that you want. So like how you move around content and give it structure is largely up to you, and you can utilize CSS a lot for this kind of thing as well. But yeah, I think basically it's whatever works best for your particular visual needs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great. Okay, cool. Are there any other questions, either vocal or in chat? I'll wait 5 seconds. Okay, cool. Yeah, so how to learn this stuff. I wasn't very specific there on many of these things, and there's kind of a reason for that, is that if I just tell you, oh, this big table of HTML elements is very important, they do these things, like it's very unlikely, unless you have a photographic memory, that you'll remember this 3 hours from now. So the best way to learn is by practicing and by making layouts. W3 Schools is a website that is a very good reference for HTML. They have good tutorials that teach you from the ground up, and I would recommend honestly going through that to start. You can also use it as a handbook if you aren't the type of person that likes to read lots of information up front. You can just try doing things yourselves and then use it as a handbook for answering particular questions. But yeah, that's basically HTML. So now we'll just talk about CSS for a bit. And I'm going to pose this question again of what do people know about CSS? The decoration of the website. Yes, there you go. You can change text colors with it. That's true. So yeah, these are all great answers. CSS is probably one of the craziest and most powerful web technologies out there. You can do an incredible amount of stuff with just CSS alone. And as a result, I think it's one of the most important things to learn, even almost a little bit more than JavaScript. And I think learning it right alongside HTML makes a lot of sense. So it stands for cascading style sheets, and talk about why in a little bit. But it's associated with HTML to change the way that the HTML appears. It tells the browser how to render that HTML. So if you think about HTML as just the structure of the website, this is like the visuals of the website and how that structure is rendered. Yeah, so basically that. So for instance, going back to this kind of example, this isn't technically proper. You would need like a style tag if you wanted to put this inside HTML, but let's just say we had this in a CSS file somewhere. We'll now say using a CSS rule that the text color of header ones are red. And then the browser sees this, applies it to the header one, and then that header text is red. Simple enough. But CSS, like lots of people think that you need JavaScript and stuff to do really fancy animations and stuff, but this is not true. A lot of the time what the JavaScript is doing is creating CSS for you to do those animations. So things like this, which has, is this playing? Yes, it is. There's like a little animated sun in the background. This is all done with CSS and HTML. There's no JavaScript at all involved here. Or you can do even crazier stuff like this little wizard animation is totally done with CSS and nothing else. You can do like interactions, you can do many different things. And they're only adding more and more experimental features to CSS today. So very cool thing to check out. But for the sake of utility and for your purposes, a lot of you may be wanting to make web apps and things like that. In order to do that, I recommend that you learn Flexbox. Flexbox is essentially a way to tell different pieces of HTML to arrange themselves in a certain way. So in like, for instance, a Zoom call, you see all the people's faces laid out in a grid. This isn't using Flexbox, but Flexbox would be used to achieve something like that. And you know, when you resize Zoom, the boxes squish together and resize. Again, this is what Flexbox would do for you. Essentially allows you to vertically align or horizontally align different elements in different ways. Then second on that list is CSS selectors. So I'll talk about this in the example, but these are essentially how you tell the browser which elements to affect with what CSS. And then lastly is how you can make reusable CSS classes, which are a type of selector. So that was kind of a lot. So I think it's best to just sort of jump into an example. But this might look familiar to you. This is that picture that I showed earlier, but it's the actual HTML and CSS of it. All right. So real quick, here you can see the HTML structure of this. So I think one interesting thing to see is without any CSS at all, it looks like this, which is kind of fine. And it's pretty much the same thing. And the reason that it's doing this is the browser applies some default CSS to everything. And that's kind of what the meaning of those intrinsic behavior of HTML elements is. But basically it's wrapping these up, and I'm actually like typing out what the tags would look like. These are not, it wouldn't show you the tags normally. But you have various headers and things like that. But with some margins and paddings and text color, you can vastly change how the appearance is. Yeah, don't let me. Let me just refresh. There we go. So just to sort of dig into the CSS over here. So we have a couple of different types of selectors here, and different selectors have different kinds of behaviors. Reading about how CSS selectors work is probably going to be the most effective thing for you because it is a little confusing. But essentially, there's, unless I'm wrong, roughly 4 major types of selectors. There's literally naming an HTML tag. So like we're saying div here. There's this kind of selector, which selects everything, which can be kind of risky to use. There's a class, which is, you would define a class like this, or you wouldn't define it. You could reference a class like this, and you would define it in HTML. So this is a class called outer, and this is just, a class is just prefixed by a period. And then there's an ID, which is prefixed by a hash, and you would reference it in HTML like this. So I actually forget the order right off the top of my head, to be honest. I should know it, but I don't. But each type of selector has a level of specificity. And what that essentially says is certain selectors are more important than others because they are more specific. So for instance, an ID is far more important than a class. Multiple things can have a class, and to be honest, multiple things can have the same ID. But just how CSS was designed is that the idea behind giving a thing an ID is it's kind of a one-off thing that you have a specific style for. So that would be that. And then any styles in here. So for instance, if I had like, let me give you, see if I can get it to render. I know. I wish I could make it just refresh. Well, take my word for it that this margin defined in this class would be overridden by the ID because the ID is more specific. So yeah, but otherwise you can do things like give things a border, give them padding, give them text color, set the font size. There's so much you can do with CSS, and a lot of it is going to come down to what you read and learn and experiment with. But yeah. And again, like making layouts is probably the most important thing you can do. And then there's some games like CSS Diner, which help you figure out how selectors work and things like that by solving little puzzles. And then there's also the Mozilla Web Docs, which are another excellent resource, as well as W3, which can help you learn. So a side note too is that you'll often see CSS frameworks out in the wild, things like Bootstrap or Tachyons. These essentially are a big set of pre-made CSS classes that you can use to achieve different types of layouts. And they definitely make writing your website faster, but I would say that if you aren't familiar with how CSS worked, they kind of subtract from your learning. And I would avoid them until you can write your own CSS, especially because you'll learn lots of important things about maintainability and what effective styling is before you just kind of like use somebody else's stuff. But if you do need to do something very quickly or get off the ground running, then they can be a good choice for you. Okay, so this is probably the last thing we'll talk about today, which is JavaScript. So last question is, what do people know about JavaScript? And I need to open the chat again. Any guesses on what JavaScript does? Yes. Interactivity for sure. Okay. So interactivity is definitely a thing. HTML and CSS can do a lot of interactivity, but essentially the thing with HTML is that it's, here, let's see, sorry, let me pull up my notes as well. The thing with HTML is that you cannot change it. It is static unless you're using JavaScript. So that's pretty much what the most important thing is. And if you want to make any kind of advanced web application, then you're going to need to use JavaScript. But at the same time, if you want to make an advanced web application, you need to build layouts. And to do that, you need HTML and CSS. So that's why you learn those two first before involving yourself with JavaScript too much. But JavaScript is also one of the craziest programming languages on the planet. It was created in 10 days by some people who are probably on a lot of coffee. It has nothing to do with Java except for some syntax. And it powers so much of the internet today, which is not what it was really originally designed for. It was for tiny little changes to websites. But now we have giant apps like Google Slides that thrive on JavaScript and things like that. So basically, the idea is to dynamically modify HTML and CSS on a web page. There's also a whole bunch of other things that it does today, but we'll get to that in a little bit. And at different levels of complexity, this is essentially what web frameworks do. So this is just what React does. It just changes HTML and CSS on the page. Same with Vue or Angular or jQuery or any number of these JavaScript frameworks. So kind of going back to our example here, we have this HTML and CSS, and we say the text in here is my header, but then after this renders, some JavaScript runs that changes what the inner HTML of this element is to your header, and then the result is shown. You could also change the class here. You could change the styling. You can do anything that you yourself could change about an HTML element, you can change with JavaScript. So as I said, you can get very far without using JavaScript, and there are HTML elements that have default behavior that give you certain types of behavior. But if you want to do like advanced animations or pull external data into your application, then you will need JavaScript. So what the most important thing to learn with JavaScript is, as I mentioned, there are many different things it can do. But I think the most critical one is the DOM API, which stands for the Document Object Model API. The Document Object Model, in essence, is what the browser uses to think about HTML, essentially. If you kind of take a different example of, like, say you have an application that sells cars, the coding language behind that application needs to understand what a car is. It needs to represent it some way. It'll have things like its make and model and other properties that are belonging to a car. The DOM is essentially the same thing, but for an HTML file. It understands what elements are there, what elements go where, what their styles are, all those different types of things. So that's what JavaScript actually changes, is it updates the DOM so that what is rendered is different. So this will give you like really basic understanding of how to manipulate the page. Like this is an example of using the DOM API, of getting an element and then changing its HTML. Then there's this library called jQuery, which makes a lot of that stuff easier for you. So that's something that can be useful for you to learn afterwards. And if you learn this and you're interested in learning advanced frameworks like React and stuff, the transition will make a lot of sense if you do it in this order. And then lastly, an important thing that many websites do is fetch data, pulling in things like weather or tasks or all of your files. And this is done through something called the Fetch API. For those of you not familiar with the term API, that stands for application programming interface. And it has many different forms and meanings, but, well, not too many meanings, but many different forms. And essentially, it's just a way for two pieces of software to talk to each other. That's pretty much it. The English language is something of an API because I can say certain things and you can interpret them and understand them. And that's kind of like how two programs communicate, is their external APIs. Okay. So let's just do a quick example. I think we are here. Perfect. All right. So this is a really simple web app. It's a counter. So it's got two buttons. Doesn't have very good validation. But you can increase the counter or you can decrease the counter. And let's just take a look. We'll take a look at the HTML as well as the CSS is less important here, just kind of styling. But we basically have a div with some text in it. And then we have an element that keeps a 0. So without JavaScript, we couldn't change the 0, but this is what we'll change. And we'll give this an ID so it's easy to find. And then we'll have two buttons. And like we saw, we can include a little bit of JavaScript. We'll call a function in the onClick, and one will decrease and one will increase. So coming over to the JavaScript, and this is also something to know that you'll learn pretty soon on in figuring out JavaScript, is that kind of everything exists in the same room. So I could as long as the script is mentioned somewhere in the HTML file and it's pulled in, these functions will be available, which can lead to some crazy results, but in general makes this pretty easy. So all these functions do is we get the element that contains the count, and then we try to make that into a number, which it luckily is. If we had something else here, we would run into an issue. We would get an error. And then that returns a number that is the current count. And then set count, well, don't worry about this quite yet, gets the count element again, and then sets what the number is. So then all we have is increase and decrease. Is we are getting the current count, we're adding 1 to it, or we're subtracting 1 from it. And that's how this works. So just to sort of show how you can extend these kinds of things, one flaw of this is that it always resets to 0 every time we refresh the page. But what you can do is you can keep things around in the browser with JavaScript using local storage. So I just set it to 5, now refresh, and it's still 5. And the way that this is done is, what we're essentially doing is we're telling the browser, hey, keep track of this thing called count. And then we give it the number. And every time we load the page, we say, give me the last value for the count that you were keeping track of, and we set that. So there are a number of different little APIs that you can use. This one's called the storage API to achieve different results on a website. You can play audio files. You can render games inside of the browser. We'll go over a list of frameworks that are useful for you, or a list of APIs that can be useful for you, which are right here. So yeah, just looking at this full list, look at ambient light events, who knows? Bluetooth, lots of really, really cool stuff. WebGL is the one for rendering games inside the API, or inside a website. I think there's one for, well, there's lots and lots of stuff. But these are probably the most important ones. The DOM one, which lets you manipulate the page. Web storage, which lets you keep stuff around, at least on a single computer. And then fetch, which lets you make API calls. We'll talk about that in a sec. But pause. Any questions so far on JavaScript or anything like that? Okay, cool. So yeah, again, learning this, it's just practice. At the end of this, I have a sample project that you can try and do if you'd like to, that kind of goes through doing something with HTML and CSS and then adding some JavaScript to it. But Mozilla Web Docs and W3 is a handbook. There's a thing on these docs called the, this is the CSS one, but there is a JavaScript guide. These 4 things will teach you everything you need to know about JavaScript. And it's very helpful. I actually just read it the other day because I had an interview and it was useful. And since JavaScript is so wacky and has such strange behavior, it's very helpful to know the rules of it before you get too much into it. All right, I lied. There's one more topic that I do want to put into your awareness before we can stop, and that's HTTP. And so I'm going to ask a different question here. And this is kind of just like a random shot in the dark question. But when I type this into the browser and hit enter, what do people think are happening? Or what do people think is happening here? Any guess will do. Okay, that is a good but wild. That is a wild but good guess. You were searching things in Google browser. That is correct. So yes, maybe it would have been helpful to give context on HTTP, but essentially what this is doing is Google has an API that they run. It's on a computer. It runs on many computers, actually. But basically, what you can use this API for is information. You can type in a word into a browser, and the browser will then ask Google's computer, which is out there, hey, give me information. Let me search for hello. And Google will give you a ton of information back about that. Google happens to make the browser and google.com, so that's kind of nice for them. But you could still do this in Firefox or anything like that, of course, right? And in very specific terms, what is happening when I do here, this is the browser is making an HTTP request to that computer running google.com. And then that computer is giving the browser some information back. So HTTP essentially is a way for computers to communicate with one another and send information between different computers. That's pretty much it. I said that APIs are kind of like, I would say, basically it's like what computers can provide to one another, and then HTTP is how the computers can actually speak to one another. So this is kind of like the last thing that you need to touch on, but it's kind of the last step to like building something really robust. And what this is like stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. So protocol is essentially like a set of instructions, a thing we expect. So if we're talking English here, like a protocol might be something like a greeting where I say hello, and then it is generally agreed that you say hello back. And then I say, how are you doing? And you say fine. That's like a set of instructions that is how we should communicate. If I say hello, and then you say something completely random, like I ate cereal for breakfast, that's kind of weird. And it doesn't necessarily like fit with the protocol. So I don't really know how to continue the conversation there. But browsers essentially make these HTTP requests to URLs. So you'll see that like, hello, this is a URL where it's at the search location and my query is hello. And different URLs produce different results. And then browsers can then generally use that web page or something to display the information in that response. And you can respond with tons of different types of data. It can be text, it can be HTML, it could be images, it could be video, lots of different stuff. And JavaScript can be used to make these HTTP requests. So when you need to fetch data, you need to understand how HTTP works. The most basic stuff that you need to be aware of is get, post, delete, and put. And basically what these are ways to say, like, using HTTP, I want you to give me some data. That's it. Post is like, using HTTP, I want to change some data somewhere. Delete is deleting data. And then put is like, you can use post to do this, but it's kind of like a variant of post where you can use it to alter data. So another thing is kind of what I said here is like, you can include information with your request. So sometimes you need to be authorized to do something. Like oftentimes when you log into an account on Google or something like that, that's creating an HTTP request. But you need to be authorized to do that as an individual. You need to know your password and stuff like that. So you can attach that information to your HTTP requests. Another thing that you will quickly encounter in web development is something called CORS, which will cause you a lot of strife. But it's basically a defense mechanism that browsers have built in so that you don't randomly execute JavaScript everywhere willy-nilly. Essentially, you can look more into this on your own time, but it's kind of like if if you want to, say I have an API out there, a computer that has information on me. It has like my name and my birthday and all these different things. And I don't want like just anybody getting this information. There are a couple of ways I could lock it down, but CORS is one of those examples where I can set a rule with CORS that only my personal website can access that information. And anyone else trying to access that information, it won't work. So it can be safe for you and also like keep your browser generally secure. And then there are things called HTTP response codes. So something you might have encountered before is a 404 page, which is when you can't find something. So that's an example of a response code. 200 is the standard, okay, good job, this request worked. And there are tons and tons of other ones that you can learn at your leisure. And then there's this last thing, which is another JavaScript API called fetch, which is used for making these HTTP requests. So I don't really have like a example built out here. But what I recommend you do is you just find an API that you're curious about. News API is a good example. And it has like a bunch of daily headlines and things like that. Another good thing to start with is weather API. This is kind of like a de facto starter project kind of deal where you make a little weather app, and you can get information about, different locations and stuff like that. But there are lots of different cool APIs. There's jokes, quotes, anything out there. And before you do it with JavaScript, there's this little tool called curl that you can use to make HTTP requests from your command line. And that's something that's very useful for you to use. It's pretty straightforward, and this article is pretty good on it. But like, if we wanted to do a get, like getting some information, it's curl and the URL. So pretty straightforward. But then you can do a bunch of other stuff. And then the last thing is just taking what you learned from curl and understanding what HTTP is, and then applying it to JavaScript. So this is an example of making a GET request in JavaScript where this person is getting stories from Reddit and then printing them out to the console. And it will give you information like this, pretty much. And you'll learn about some other things like JSON, which is a way that people store data. or store it is mostly like represented very often. But yeah, those are all concepts that kind of build on one another. So yeah, I know there's a lot about HTTP, and that's probably the most like complicated nitty-gritty topic. But are there any questions or anything I can clarify right off the bat? Okay, cool. All right, so one last quick thing. This will take, oh wait, no, there was a question, sorry. What is this kind called? Oh yeah, so what you just typed in there is an IP address. So IP addresses are kind of like URLs in that pretty much an IP address is like the location of a computer. So what URLs really are at the end of the day is a nicer way to say an IP. Deployment, which is what we're going to talk about right now, actually, can become very complicated. URLs can point to many different machines. For instance, like if you have a website that a lot of people use, if you run that on a single computer and like 30,000 people visit your site, bye China, thanks for coming. Like 30,000 people come to your site, then your site's going to be tanked. Like that computer can't handle that number of requests. So people will distribute it on two different computers. So if one computer starts getting too much load, then they'll redirect the traffic to another computer. And now both are just handling 15,000 each, which is fine. So each computer has an IP, and that URL routes to the IP. Does that make sense? So this one in particular is a lot like localhost. So 127.0.0.1 is the address. If I'm like running a little thing on my own computer, this is the IP I would reference it at. The browser is also smart enough to know that if you type localhost 8000 in, it will actually just be, but yeah. But if you ever like make a little web app with React or honestly like anything, you'll often find yourself going to localhost 3000, and that will be where your local website is. And then you can deploy it. Yeah. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, cool. So last quick thing. So we've kind of come this far, but all good websites are on the internet. So eventually you'll want to do this. There's pretty much an easy and a hard way to do it. But just to give some more background on domains and URLs and things like that, the base of a URL is called a domain. So something like google.com or twitter.com, things like that. You have to buy these and then you own it and nobody else can use it. So domains point to these IP addresses, which are computers out there. And there's often complex technology that does that routing. But you can also have multiple levels. So like you can attach things to the front of your URL. You can't attach things to the end, but for instance, like the Scout website is at scout.camd.northeastern.edu. So the easiest way to deploy a website is to use a thing called Netlify. And this is basically at the push of a button, you can deploy your website that you store in GitHub or something like that. You can have pretty complex stuff. Pretty much every, like this website is hosted on Netlify. So you can host like React apps and things like that on here. This is a React website. And you can use your own domain, as with many hosting services. If you want to do this the hard way, but really learn something, you can look into a technology called NGINX. And what NGINX does is it's a program that runs on a computer that knows how to do that trafficking to different URLs or to different IPs and stuff. So it can accept incoming HTTP requests and then send them back, pretty much. But you'll also need a little computer to run your web server on. So people often use these virtual private servers, which somebody essentially just runs a little computer for you, and you pay like $5 a month for it, and you can use whatever you want. you can do whatever you want on it to some degree. And then, so on your little computer that you have, you would run NGINX and you would serve your website that way. There are definitely tutorials out there on how to do this, but this will get you very familiar with how websites work. Yeah, so I included a tutorial here, but I would try just starting out with Netlify just right off the bat because it'll be easier for you and less of a headache. But when you learn HTML and CSS, try deploying it. Try deploying like just a plain HTML file to see how it works. It really helps to see it live on the internet and working. And it feels good to have something out there that literally anyone could see. So yeah, to summarize, HTML and CSS are your two best friends. You want to learn them first, into JavaScript. And then once you need to pull data into your website, figure out HTTP and deploy everything all of the time. So if you're curious, I have this like template GitHub repository that walks you through building this, which is kind of just like a simple weather app. And this will like get you really familiar with Flexbox if you choose to use it, or you could use CSS Grid, whatever you want to do, styling things to make it look pretty and stuff like that. And then later applying JavaScript so that you can make these values update to what is real and stuff like that. And this ends up being like, though it looks simple, a fairly hefty project. So mostly when you hit the JavaScript part, and depending on your experience. So, but yeah, you'll all do things like fonts and stuff like that, which can be trickier than you might imagine. But yeah, you just like make the layout, hard code that data in, add some JavaScript, learn how to use the weather API, and then use JavaScript to update your page with the data and then put it on Netlify. And this is the link for it. You can just like clone the template if you want to do it. And if you run into any problems or questions on it, if you choose to do it, let me know. I'd be happy to help. I can put my email in the chat. But yeah, I think that's a good place to stop. Are there any final questions? Okay. Well, either way, I put my email in there. Always feel free to reach out if you're ever anywhere on your web development journey and you want advice. I'll do the best I can to advise you. And otherwise, thank you all for coming. It was fun to have you.
Pathfinder meets every week for roundtable discussions. We also meet weekly for workshops just like this one. So check out our Google Calendar and join in next time. Thank you so much and have a great day.